The forest outside our pack's mountainside home stretched endlessly in a tapestry of silver light and shadow, the moon spilling over the tree line like a quiet blessing, and for a moment, I allowed myself to forget the weight of being Luna, the responsibilities that tethered me to a life of rituals, loyalty, and destiny I had only just begun to understand. I sat alone on the wooden balcony of our lodge, cradling a warm cup of herbal tea in my hands, the faint steam curling into the night air. And the gentle wind carried whispers from the trees, stirring memories I had long buried, of a time when life was simpler, quieter, and yet somehow hollow, as if the pull of something unseen had been nudging me toward this moment all along. For even in these ordinary hours there was an awareness I could not shake, a subtle tension threading through the night, making my skin prickle with anticipation, as though the forest itself were alive, watching, waiting for me to notice. The Alpha had been gone earlier, called away on a pack matter that required his presence, leaving me with a rare stretch of solitude, a rare taste of freedom, and though I should have felt relief, a part of me sensed the lingering gaze of a presence I could not name, an observer in the shadows, silent yet insistent, a form darker than the midnight sky, muscles coiled like steel and eyes gleaming a faint, almost imperceptible red. Hidden between the branches but catching the faintest glimmer of moonlight, the presence of Kael, the rogue wolf whose reputation whispered through the pack in murmurs and fragmented warnings, the wolf of secrets and shadow, who moved unseen yet seemed to know every heartbeat, every breath, every thought that flickered across my mind before I could even speak it aloud. And though I had only glimpsed him from the corner of my vision, never approaching, never intervening, his aura left a mark, a tension that tightened in my chest as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I sipped my tea, the warmth spreading through my fingers, yet I could not stop my eyes from scanning the tree line, tracing the lines of shadow for any hint of movement, and I felt the forest answer in kind, leaves trembling, branches shifting, a low rustle that might have been the wind, or might have been him, Kael, watching, waiting, guarding, or perhaps judging, and a shiver ran down my spine not from fear, but from the strange pull of curiosity, as though he carried a truth I had not yet earned, a story I was meant to find in time, and even though he did not move closer, his presence pressed against my awareness like an unseen hand, stirring questions I could not voice, pulling at the edges of my calm, ordinary evening like a shadow brushing the periphery of light. Below me, the pack's lodge hummed with quiet life, the soft murmur of the younger wolves practicing their forms, their shadows flickering against the warm glow of lanterns, and I felt the contrast sharply, the warmth of belonging versus the cold, unclaimed mystery of the forest, of Kael, of the secrets he carried with him, hidden just beyond reach, always observing, always present, and I wondered if his eyes had followed me here all along, marking me as someone who would one day cross paths with destiny in ways I could not yet imagine. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of pine, earth, and something stranger, a faint musk that made my heart skip, a sense that even as I sat in the comfort of my ordinary world, the threads of fate were already twisting, tying me to moments I had not yet lived, decisions I had not yet made, and I realized that the stillness I had clung to was an illusion, a fragile mask over the currents of power, loyalty, and unseen influence that ran through the pack, and through the forest itself, and through me. I felt a quiet stirring inside, an awareness that tonight something would begin, though I could not yet name it, and the memory of Kael's red eye, glowing faintly through the trees, seemed to follow me even as I turned away, my gaze lingering on the edge of shadow where moonlight met the dark undergrowth, and in that instant, the world felt both familiar and completely new, as though the ordinary life I had known was only the prologue, a gentle calm before the storm of destiny, and I could not help but sense that Kael, always watching, would be the first to herald the change I was destined to face, though in that quiet moment, he remained just a shadow, a whisper, a promise of mysteries that would not wait for permission, and as I breathed in the crisp night air, my fingers wrapped around the warm cup, I felt the faintest thrill of apprehension and anticipation, a knowing that this ordinary world, so comforting and safe, was already shifting beneath my feet, and somewhere between the silver light of the moon and the dark eyes of the rogue wolf in the distance, my story was quietly, inexorably beginning. The morning light filtered softly through the frost-kissed branches, painting the forest in shades of silver and green, and as I stepped outside to stretch, the crisp air filled my lungs with a sense of unfamiliar anticipation, a pulse beneath the ordinary rhythm of the pack that I could neither name nor ignore. The lodge was quiet, the Alpha still away on matters that required his steady presence, and for a moment, I felt the rare luxury of solitude, though the forest seemed different somehow, alive in ways I had never noticed, as though the trees themselves were leaning closer to listen to my heartbeat, or perhaps whisper secrets I could not yet hear. And I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as if the wind carried a language only half formed, half understood, a murmuring of destiny brushing at the edges of perception. The air shifted, faint and subtle, and my instincts, honed by the pack but often unaware of the unseen currents, prickled in recognition of something out of place, something that stirred both caution and curiosity within me. And then, just beyond the line of birch and pine, a dark shape flickered, moving so smoothly, so silently, that I could not be sure I had truly seen it. Yet the faint glow of red in the shadow, just for a heartbeat, made me freeze, my pulse racing, for it was Kael, the rogue wolf whose presence haunted the edge of every pack story, whose secrets were whispered by those too cautious to speak aloud. And even though he did not step closer, did not speak, did not reveal himself beyond the brief flash of his glowing eye, the sensation of being observed wrapped around me like the fog curling along the forest floor, and I could not shake the feeling that he was testing me, measuring me, preparing for something I did not yet understand. As I continued along the path, I noticed subtle oddities, leaves that seemed to tremble without wind, a fleeting sense of being followed, and a strange surge of emotion, a pulse in my chest that made the world sharper, more alive, as though every sound, every shadow, every breath of air carried meaning I had not been trained to perceive, and I realized that my own instincts, usually steady and reliable, were reacting to forces beyond the ordinary, as if the forest, the pack, and even Kael himself were conspiring to awaken something dormant within me. A soft rustle in the undergrowth drew my gaze, and I swore I glimpsed the silhouette of a large, dark wolf slip between the trees, a shadow moving like smoke, his glowing red eye catching the sun's first rays, just long enough to leave me questioning whether I had imagined him or whether he had been there to silently mark me, a subtle signature of his presence, a promise or warning I could not yet decipher. Even as I shook off the tension and tried to focus on ordinary tasks, tidying my space, preparing herbs, listening to the younger wolves training outside, I felt Kael's influence in imperceptible ways, a branch falling in a peculiar rhythm, a sudden breeze that seemed to carry intention, and a quiet, almost electric awareness of being watched, not with malice but with purpose, as though he had knowledge of what I was not ready to understand, and that knowledge wrapped around my consciousness like a net I could not escape. Later, as I wandered to the edge of the stream that marked the boundary of the packlands, I found patterns in the fallen leaves that seemed too precise to be natural, circles and arcs that made no sense yet felt deliberate, almost like a message left in the language of shadow and instinct, and I sensed Kael had been there, briefly stepping into the light, observing my reactions, testing whether I noticed, teaching me, though in a manner I could not yet name. And when I lifted my eyes to the forest beyond, the dark line of trees seemed to shift, to breathe, as though acknowledging my awareness, or perhaps teasing it, and the faint glow of red vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the echo of curiosity, the pull of questions with no answers. The alpha returned at dusk, his presence steady and reassuring, grounding me in the familiar warmth of the pack, yet even as I spoke with him, laughed quietly at the younger wolves' antics, and settled into the rhythm of evening. The sense of unseen currents tugged at my thoughts, a subtle dissonance I could not explain, and I kept finding my gaze drifting toward the forest, toward the line where shadow and moonlight blended, half expecting to see that glimmer of red, half hoping, half fearing it, knowing that Kael's eyes could appear at any moment, silent and watchful, a reminder that my life was no longer entirely my own. As night fell and the moon rose high, spilling silver over the lodge and the trees, I stepped outside once more, drawn by the quiet pull I could neither name nor resist, and there in the distance, I caught the faintest movement, a ripple in the darkness, and for a heartbeat, the red glow returned, fixed upon me, unblinking and deliberate, and I felt the first true shiver of destiny brush against my skin, a whisper that my ordinary world was already shifting, that something unseen was shaping the path ahead. And though Kael made no sound, left no trace beyond that brief glance, I knew with certainty that he had already begun to weave his influence into my life, and that the days to come would be anything but ordinary. And yet, as I drew a deep breath of night air, I could not help but wonder whether I was ready for what his secrets, and the forces behind them, would soon demand of me. The morning mist clung to the forest like a veil, softening the edges of the trees and casting the mountainside in an almost dreamlike glow, and as I stepped along the familiar path that led from the lodge toward the training grounds, I felt the air shift, charged with a presence I had not known before, a gravity that pulled at my chest and made every instinct hum with awareness, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge him. He emerged from the shadows at the forest's edge, and my breath caught, for there was something magnetic in the way he moved, a silent authority that demanded attention without a word. Quiet strength in the tilt of his shoulders and the ease of his gaze, and though he did not smile, his eyes held warmth, curiosity, and an unspoken challenge that made the hair on my arms rise, as if the forest were conspiring to reveal him to me at this precise moment. I sensed the Alpha approaching behind me, steady and unshakable, and yet even his presence could not diminish the pull of this new figure, whose aura seemed to shimmer in the spaces between the trees, blending with the mist and sunlight impossible to ignore. And then, as I instinctively turned my head toward the periphery of my vision, I caught the shadow again, the unmistakable outline of Kael, dark and muscular, his left eye glowing faintly red like a spark caught in the night, his gaze fixed on me, on the newcomer, and for a brief moment, he tilted his head as though to remind me that even in this magnetic encounter, I was not seeing the full picture. The stranger took a careful step forward, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the quiet like a bell in fog. "I've been looking for you," and something in those words stirred an unidentifiable longing and curiosity within me, a ripple of emotion that made my pulse quicken, while Kael remained silent, yet his red eye seemed to flare ever so slightly, as if warning me to pay attention, to notice what was hidden beneath the calm confidence of this figure. The Alpha arrived at the edge of the clearing just then, his stance protective yet restrained, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the newcomer, and I realized that there was tension in the air, unspoken but palpable, a delicate balance of loyalty and intrigue, for the forest itself seemed to sense the meeting of these two forces, the Alpha grounded like an unyielding tree and the stranger radiating a current of magnetic unpredictability that made my thoughts whirl in quiet chaos. I felt my own hands tighten at my sides, the muscles in my neck and shoulders pulling instinctively toward readiness, yet fascination rooted me in place because this figure, who could have been an outsider, a wanderer, or something more than mortal, carried with him a presence that both frightened and intrigued, and I was acutely aware that even my breath seemed louder than it should be, echoing across the misted clearing, while Kael lingered beyond the tree-line, silent, observing, his whisper of a thought brushing my mind like wind through leaves. "Your Alpha isn't who you think he is," and I shivered, not from fear but from the weight of the words, the sudden realization that beneath the steady, familiar strength of my Alpha there were depths I had yet to uncover, mysteries that this new presence somehow reflected, challenged, or revealed. The stranger stepped closer, sun glinting off his hair, the scent of pine and earth blending with something unfamiliar yet strangely comforting, a fragrance that stirred memories I could not place, and as our eyes met, I felt a tension coil in my chest, part expectation, part caution, a thrill of awareness that my ordinary understanding of the pack, of the Alpha, and of myself was quietly shifting. Kael's shadow flitted along the edge of the clearing, unmoving but unmistakable, a silent reminder that he had been present long before my gaze met this figure's, that he had perhaps orchestrated, observed, or simply waited for the precise moment to deliver his subtle warning, and I realized that the red flash of his eye was more than observation. It was judgment, or perhaps guidance, an enigmatic prompt that there were truths I had not yet earned, layers beneath the surface that would reveal themselves slowly, like the forest unfolding under the morning mist. The stranger's voice broke through the tension again, quieter this time. "You're more important than you know." And I felt the weight of the statement settle over me like the first heavy snow of winter, unasked for, yet inevitable, and I knew that even in this fleeting encounter, in the glance of a stranger, the warmth of sunlight through the leaves, and the silent observation of Kael lurking in the shadows, the world I had thought I understood was beginning to change, that threads I could not see were weaving together, connecting the Alpha, the newcomer, and myself in ways that were already shaping my path. I stepped forward instinctively, compelled by curiosity, and the forest seemed to contract around me, the mist swirling like breath, the birds quiet, the rustle of leaves suspended, and Kael's gaze held me, tethered my attention with his silent insistence as if he alone knew the consequences of what was about to unfold. The stranger smiled faintly, enigmatic and unthreatening, a gesture that hinted at knowledge I did not yet possess, and my heart beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition, as though we had met before in a dream I could not recall, and even the alpha, usually so perceptive, stood at the edge of the clearing, poised and watchful, unable to intervene in the subtle current between us. Then Kael's red eye flared once more, brief as a spark, and his silent thought brushed my mind. Trust will be tested, Luna, and not all shadows are what they seem. And I felt an undeniable shiver of destiny ripple through me, the realization settling with quiet inevitability that this encounter, the magnetic presence of the stranger, the steady power of the alpha, and the lurking gaze of Kael, were the first threads of a pattern I could not yet understand but could already feel shaping my heart and mind, as I inhaled the crisp air, the mist curling around my feet and the sunlight breaking through the treetops in scattered rays. The stranger inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of recognition or perhaps invitation, and in that small gesture, 1,000 questions arose, unanswered yet irresistible, pulling me forward, toward a story that was no longer ordinary, a life I could no longer leave behind. And in the distant shadow of the forest, Kael lingered, his red eye a final, enigmatic reminder that the mysteries of this new connection, and the secrets yet to be revealed, would not be simple, and that the ordinary world I had known was quietly dissolving beneath the weight of destiny, presence, and unseen truths. The morning came like any other, pale sunlight filtering through the trees, yet as I moved through the lodge, preparing the herbs and listening to the soft murmurs of the pack stirring around me, there was a weight in the air I could not place, a subtle tension threading through the familiar sights and sounds, as if the ordinary world I had known had already begun to tilt without my permission. Even the alpha's presence, steady and grounding, seemed tinged with something unspoken, an energy that hummed beneath the surface of our routines, drawing my awareness toward subtle shifts I had never noticed, like the way the younger wolves hesitated in their drills, eyes flicking to shadows I could not see, or the way the trees shivered even in the absence of wind, a soft rustle that carried intent rather than nature. And I felt the first stirrings of unease mix with a strange thrill that prickled my senses, reminding me that the pack's world had always been more alive than it appeared, but now it seemed almost fragile, susceptible to forces unseen and barely understood. The dreams had started again last night, images both vivid and fleeting, moments I could not place in the waking world, glimpses of crimson light cutting through branches, the sensation of being watched from beyond the mist, and a feeling that decisions I had yet to make were already shaping the path I walked. And as I shook off the remnants of sleep, I sensed Kael before I even saw him, his shadow slipping between trees at the edge of my vision, silent and taut with purpose, his red eye glimmering like a warning. Yet he did not approach, did not speak, only observed, leaving his message unspoken but understood, a gentle nudge that something vital was unfolding and that my attention must not waver. Throughout the day, coincidences multiplied in ways that felt uncanny. A fallen branch that seemed to form a pattern too deliberate to be natural, the whisper of wind carrying words I thought I imagined, and the scent of something both familiar and foreign, lingering just long enough to stir memory and curiosity. And each time I turned, Kael was gone, leaving only the echo of his presence, like the brush of a ghost across my skin, reminding me that the forest, the pack, and my life were all more entwined with destiny than I had dared believe. The alpha's voice called me to the training grounds, steady and commanding, yet as I moved toward him, I found myself hesitating, my instincts tingling, and the sensation of being measured, watched, evaluated, prickled the back of my neck. And in that moment Kael appeared briefly at the tree-line, his form coiled and silent, eyes flashing red, and I felt his unspoken question. "Do you see it yet?" Which I did not fully understand but sensed as a warning, a prompt to be aware, to pay attention to the cracks forming in the familiar world I had relied upon. The day unfolded in a strange rhythm, small events layering into a pattern I could barely perceive. A misplaced item in the lodge, the young wolves' laughter cutting short as they glanced to the tree-line, an echo in the distance that sounded like my own name whispered by the wind, and each incident, though seemingly minor, left a residue of tension in my chest, a pressure I could not shake, as if threads of fate were weaving around me, invisible yet undeniable, drawing me toward decisions I had not yet realized I was making. By mid-afternoon I found myself alone in the clearing near the stream. The sunlight dappled through the branches, and I felt a surge of emotion that caught me unprepared. A wave of longing, fear, and clarity that all at once made my heart pound and my vision sharpen, as if the ordinary world had peeled back a layer, revealing hidden textures of life and consequence I had never noticed before. and as I breathed deeply, grounding myself, I caught the faintest movement beyond the water's edge, a shimmer of shadow that resolved into Kael's unmistakable form, crouched in silence, gaze fixed, and for a heartbeat, I imagined he spoke without words, planting the seed of an understanding I could not yet name, a hint that my life would never be the same, that ordinary had already slipped through my fingers. The sun dipped lower, spilling molten light across the forest floor, and the Alpha returned from his duties. His presence a calm center amid the shifting currents I felt, yet even his steadying hand could not erase the sensation that the world had subtly rearranged itself while I was distracted by routine, that moments I had ignored or dismissed carried weight I was only beginning to sense, and that Kael's eyes, glowing red just at the edge of perception, marked more than observation. They were a measure, a warning, and perhaps even a guide, threading the unseen through my life and forcing me to confront that what I had considered ordinary was never truly under my control. Twilight descended, the forest deepening into shades of indigo and silver, and as I walked back toward the lodge, the final flicker of red caught my gaze, lingering for the briefest moment before vanishing behind a tree, leaving me with the echo of a presence that was both comforting and unsettling, and I realized, with a quiet, sinking certainty, that the life I had assumed I understood, the routine I had trusted, the calm I had relied upon, all of it had shifted imperceptibly under the gaze of forces I could not yet see or name, and that the ordinary world I had clung to was no longer mine alone, but a stage upon which destinies, secrets, and the quiet influence of a rogue wolf were already unfolding, and in that realization, I felt both awe and apprehension, knowing instinctively that nothing would ever be the same again, and that the first ripple of change, subtle as a whispered word in the mist, had already begun to shape everything I thought I knew. The morning sun spilled gold across the forest clearing, dappling the dew-soaked grass with light, and as I walked alongside the Alpha through the quiet training grounds, I felt a subtle shift in the air, a closeness that had been growing over the past days, the way our movements synchronized without thought, the gentle brush of hands as we adjusted a stance, the quiet murmur of words exchanged with ease, layered with understanding and unspoken reassurance, and each gesture, each glance, carried weight far beyond its simplicity, making my heart beat with an awareness that we were no longer merely allies bound by duty, but companions intertwined in a delicate, fragile rhythm, an invisible tether that pulled tighter with every shared smile, every soft laugh at a young wolf's clumsy attempt at agility, and even in the moments of silence, the unspoken connection spoke louder than words, echoing through the trees, vibrating against the forest floor as if the very earth were acknowledging it. Yet beneath this blossoming closeness, I felt the faint but persistent brush of Kael's presence, always at the edge of perception, a shadow slipping between the trees, his glowing red eye glimpsed only in peripheral vision, a silent observer whose intentions remained inscrutable, whose subtle influence seemed to guide the rhythm of our bond without ever intruding directly, and I sensed that he was watching the unfolding of something far greater than a simple friendship, that he measured not just our actions but our hearts, and that every step we took together was observed, recorded, and perhaps nudged toward a destiny only he understood. As the Alpha leaned down to help me steady my footing after a tricky maneuver, his hand brushed mine, fleeting and electric in its simplicity, and the air seemed to pause, charged with the quiet intensity of a connection that had been forming patiently, unspoken yet undeniable, and I caught a glimpse of movement behind the trees, a ripple of shadow, a brief flare of red from Kael's eye, and I shivered, aware that the rogue wolf's presence marked not just observation, but warning, a reminder that even as warmth and trust grew between the Alpha and me, there were forces and truths still hidden in the shadows, subtle tests of our hearts and instincts that I could not yet name. The young wolves called out to us from the edge of the clearing, laughing and stumbling in practice, and the Alpha smiled at them with the patience of a leader and the care of someone who understood the weight of responsibility. Yet when his gaze returned to me, it carried something different, something personal, intimate in its depth, a quiet reassurance that transcended words, and I realized that the connection we were building was not merely of duty or circumstance, but of choice, of mutual understanding, a bond that pulsed like the undercurrent of the forest, quiet yet powerful, and just as I reached to respond with a gesture, a word, a smile that might reveal my own feelings, the wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of movement, and Kael's presence became unmistakable, the red of his left eye catching the sunlight in a single glint as if marking the moment, sending a silent message that this bond, however genuine, was observed, measured, and perhaps even challenged, and that his cryptic influence was never far from the threads of our growing connection. Later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, we settled near the stream to watch the water ripple over smooth stones, and the Alpha spoke softly, sharing a story of the pack's history of loyalty and courage, his voice carrying both authority and tenderness, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn not just to the story but to him, to the steady cadence of his words, the subtle gestures that revealed kindness and strength in equal measure, and I realized that the moments of connection, the unspoken understanding, had become essential, a lifeline in the shifting, unpredictable world I had been thrust into. Kael lingered across the stream, crouched in shadow, his gaze fixed on us, and, though he remained silent, the forest seemed to bend around his presence, the rustle of leaves and whisper of the wind carrying the faintest sense of warning or guidance, a reminder that even as hearts intertwined, the unseen forces of destiny, mystery, and secret truths were never far away, shaping the path ahead in ways we could not yet comprehend. As darkness fell, painting the treetops in shades of indigo and silver, I felt a sudden rush of emotion, unbidden and overwhelming, a mixture of gratitude, fear, and something more profound, a sense that I was no longer alone in facing the uncertainties of the forest, the pack, or the currents of destiny, and as I glanced at the Alpha, whose eyes mirrored the same intensity of awareness, a subtle flicker of shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, and Kael's red eye caught mine for just an instant, a silent acknowledgement, or perhaps a reminder that even in our growing closeness, nothing was ever without consequence, and that the bonds we forged would soon be tested in ways I could not yet imagine. And then, as the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky, I realized something entirely unexpected, a revelation that struck with gentle force and reshaped everything I thought I knew about the forest, the Alpha, and even myself. The trust, the connection, and the emotions I had allowed to flourish were not merely the result of familiarity or circumstance, but a force with its own gravity, a current pulling me toward a destiny I had only begun to glimpse, and Kael, always present in shadow, always observing, had been a silent witness and guide to it all, his presence threading the unseen into the fabric of our lives. And in that moment, with the Alpha's steady hand near mine and the rogue wolf's cryptic red gaze lingering in memory, I understood that my ordinary world had shifted irreversibly, that bonds formed in trust and awareness carried power, and that every heartbeat, every glance, and every shadow held the potential to change everything in ways I could never fully predict. The dawn broke pale and silver over the mountaintop, the mist curling through the trees like a living veil, and as I walked along the familiar path that led from the lodge to the sacred grove, the forest felt charged with an unspoken anticipation, as if it held its breath in silent awareness, and I could not shake the feeling that every rustle of leaves, every shaft of light slicing through the canopy, carried meaning beyond my comprehension. The Alpha walked beside me, his presence steady yet attentive, and I noticed a subtle tension in his gaze, a watchfulness that mirrored my own, as though he too sensed that ordinary understanding had already begun to fracture, leaving only fragments of truth scattered like broken glass across the forest floor, and that these fragments were meant to be pieced together, if one dared to look closely enough. Beneath the rhythm of our steps, I felt the faint, familiar stir of Kael, the rogue wolf whose presence had shadowed every turn of my life since I had arrived, moving through the underbrush with a grace that made him seem more phantom than flesh, and I caught the briefest flicker of red from his left eye, glowing like a warning flame, and I knew without question that he was more than a silent observer now. He was a guardian of truths not yet ready for my understanding, a messenger whose cryptic guidance threaded through the forest, whispering questions and nudging my awareness toward revelations I was not yet prepared to fully accept. The grove itself emerged from the mist like a dream half-remembered, ancient trees encircling a small clearing where light pooled in patches across the soft earth, and there at the center lay a circle of stones etched with symbols that hummed faintly beneath my feet, a resonance that vibrated through my bones and pulled at something deep inside, a memory I could not place, a recognition of destiny and history intertwined. The Alpha knelt, tracing his fingers along the carvings, his expression both reverent and pained, and I felt the weight of the moment pressing into my chest as he spoke, his voice low. These markings, they tell of a bond older than our pack, a prophecy long hidden from those who walk without awareness. And I sensed the truth of his words not just in his tone, but in the way the grove seemed to respond, leaves trembling, branches swaying though no wind moved, the very air thick with quiet energy. Kael appeared then at the tree-line, crouched and still, red eye flashing briefly as he tilted his head toward the stones, and in that moment I felt a connection, a subtle communication, as if he were urging me to see beyond the obvious, to read the whispers in the shadows, to understand that the story we had been living was only one layer of a far greater design, one shaped by forces, bonds, and secrets older than even the oldest pack member could remember. I stepped closer to the circle, tracing my fingers along the faint grooves, and images flared behind my eyes, glimpses of past leaders, of wolves whose faces I could not name, of moments where choices had shaped destinies, and, through it all, a faint echo of Kael's presence threaded through the visions, his gaze unwavering, his cryptic warning clear even without words. Not all you trust will guide you, and not all who vanish leave willingly. And I shivered, understanding that this was both caution and instruction, a way of framing what was to come, a nudge toward awareness and preparedness. The Alpha rose, eyes meeting mine with gravity, and spoke of the prophecy that bound our pack, the unseen threads connecting our destinies, the weight of choices yet to be made. And in his tone I heard not just duty but vulnerability, an acknowledgement that even leaders carried secrets they could not fully reveal. And I realized then that trust, intuition, and the careful attention to subtle signs were our only guides, and that Kael's shadowed presence, so often peripheral, had become central to navigating the labyrinth of truth unfolding around us. The sun climbed higher, scattering the mist into shards of light, and I felt a sudden pull in my chest, an almost electric recognition that the ordinary lives we had known were illusions, that every pattern, every coincidence, every gesture had been part of a design larger than ourselves. And Kael's eyes, flashing red once more, reinforced this understanding, his silent message echoing in my mind like a drumbeat. See clearly, Luna, or the world you trust will vanish unnoticed. I turned toward him instinctively, but he was gone as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only the echo of his presence. And then as I turned back to the circle of stones, my vision caught something that made my breath catch, a hidden carving, almost invisible in the dappled light, depicting a wolf whose eyes glowed red, shadowed yet unmistakable, entwined with a figure resembling the Alpha, a symbol that suggested connection, choice, and consequence in ways that had never been revealed. And for a moment the world tilted, the familiar forest dissolving into a revelation that reframed every step I had taken, every bond one had nurtured, every glance I had shared with the Alpha, and even the unseen observer who had always haunted the edge of my perception. The stones hummed faintly again, as though reacting to my recognition, and I realized that the prophecy did not simply describe the past. It demanded action, awareness, and courage, and that Kael, ever the silent guardian, had been preparing me for this moment all along, threading subtle warnings and signs into my daily life, ensuring that I would notice, that I would understand, and that I would act when the time came. And then as the final rays of sunlight spilled through the canopy, a sudden, startling shift occurred. A whisper of movement at the edge of my vision, a flicker of shadow, and I saw the red eye once more, brighter, closer, and in that instant, I understood the truth of Kael's cryptic guidance. The mysteries were not distant, the secrets not safely hidden, and the ordinary world I had clung to had vanished irrevocably, replaced by a reality that demanded awareness, courage, and a readiness to confront truths that would change everything I thought I knew about my pack, my Alpha, and even myself. And as I breathed deeply in the sacred grove, the hum of the stones beneath my feet, the warmth of sunlight on my skin, and the echo of Kael's red gaze all converged into a revelation that left me stunned, suspended between wonder and apprehension, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The forest was restless that morning, a low murmur running through the trees, and as I stepped onto the familiar path from the lodge, the weight of unseen currents pressed against me like a tangible force, making every rustle of leaves, every flicker of shadow, feel amplified, as though the ordinary world I had once trusted was now teetering on the edge of uncertainty. The Alpha walked beside me, his presence steady but tense, and I could feel the pull of responsibility in every gesture, every decision, every unspoken expectation that tethered me to the pack. Yet, beneath that familiarity, a new awareness stirred, a recognition that the forest, the pack, and even the patterns of everyday life were shifting in ways I could not fully grasp, leaving me unsettled, cautious, and alert to every nuance. Then as I rounded a bend in the trail, I glimpsed him, Kael, crouched low between the trees, muscles coiled, shadow blending with shadow, his glowing red eye catching the filtered sunlight for the briefest instant. And though he made no sound, his presence was Warning, a pulse of anticipation that surged through me, telling me that decisions made now carried weight far beyond the ordinary, that the balance of the pack, of my heart, and of the forest itself depended on awareness and action I had not yet fully mastered. Small disturbances seemed to follow in his wake, a fallen branch forming a pattern that I could not ignore, a flock of birds scattering in sudden alarm, the wind carrying faint whispers of words I could not fully discern, and in each instance I felt the silent tug of Kael's guidance, the unspoken instruction that the forest was testing me, measuring my readiness to face forces both internal and external, and that hesitation could carry consequences I could not yet see. The Alpha paused to inspect a small breach in the perimeter of the clearing, a disturbance that might have been natural, yet the hairs along my arms prickled with the sense of something deliberate, something unseen, and I realized that the stability of our world, which had seemed so reliable only days before, was unraveling quietly, threads of order pulled loose by forces I could neither name nor control, and Kael's gaze remained fixed on me from the shadows, a constant, unnerving reminder that I was not alone in perceiving these changes, and that his role, silent, cryptic, yet undeniably present, was entwined with the choices I would have to make. As the day wore on, small tensions escalated, tests appearing in forms both subtle and stark. Young wolves stumbled in drills that once seemed routine, minor disputes between pack members flared unexpectedly, and messages delivered from distant territories carried tones of unease and warning, and I felt the pulse of responsibility thrum through me, a call to act, to interpret, to decide where the line between caution and courage must be drawn, all while Kael's form remained at the periphery, sometimes vanishing between the trees, sometimes appearing for the briefest instant, his eye glowing red, silently punctuating each choice, each hesitation, each step forward with cryptic insistence. Later, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the forest in hues of gold and shadow, the Alpha and I reached the edge of a ravine that marked the boundary of our territory, and the disturbance there was undeniable. Tracks of an unknown wolf, patterns in the underbrush that suggested intent rather than accident, and the forest seemed to shift with every step, as if reacting to unseen currents carrying the weight of hidden truths, unspoken alliances, and the possibility of confrontation, and I felt Kael's gaze pierce me once more from the darkness, the red of his eye bright against the encroaching night, and I understood that this was more than observation. He was signaling, guiding, cautioning, testing my perception and resolve, and I could not ignore him. A surge of wind brought the scent of something familiar yet alarming, and instinctively I moved closer to the Alpha, seeking steadiness while simultaneously trusting my own awareness, and as the forest seemed to close in, shadows deepening, light fading, I realized that the fragile equilibrium of our world had shifted irreversibly, that ordinary routines could no longer be trusted, and that the decisions I made, even in small gestures, could tip the balance toward harmony or chaos. Kael moved again, silently circling the clearing, leaving marks in the earth almost imperceptible, symbols of warning or perhaps prophecy, traces that only an observant mind could interpret, and as I followed the signs, tension coiled in my chest, the forest humming in resonance with the stakes I could now feel pulsing through every leaf, every stone, every breath of air. The Alpha's hand found mine briefly, grounding me even as uncertainty wrapped around my thoughts, and in that simple touch, I felt the gravity of connection, the intertwining of trust and duty, and yet I knew instinctively that we were being tested, that Kael's presence and the subtle messages he left were not casual, that they were preparation, a rehearsal for challenges that would demand courage, clarity, and the willingness to confront truths hidden in shadow. As night fell, the forest settled into a deceptive calm, stars glinting faintly through the canopy, and I caught the final glimpse of Kael perched on a ridge above the clearing, red eye flashing once, twice, then vanishing into darkness, leaving only the echo of intent, a lingering sense of both warning and opportunity. And in that moment, I realized with sudden, piercing clarity that the ordinary world I had relied upon, the routines I had trusted, the certainty I had held, had dissolved quietly around me, leaving a landscape of choices where stakes were higher than I had imagined, where every decision mattered, and where the balance of trust, loyalty, and unseen forces now rested upon my awareness, intuition, and courage. And as I turned to face the Alpha, the tension between us mirrored the uncertainty of the forest itself, a silent acknowledgement that the moment for decisive action had arrived, and that the next step we took, guided, observed, and measured by Kael, would define not just our path, but the fragile shifting world that had quietly begun to unravel beneath our feet. The forest lay bathed in the silver light of early dawn, mist curling like whispered secrets through the trees, and as I walked along the familiar trail toward the clearing where the pack gathered, I felt a weight pressing quietly on my chest. A sense that the past, hidden and unspoken, was threading itself through the present, weaving a tapestry of truths I had only glimpsed in fragments. The Alpha walked beside me, silent at first, yet there was a tension in his shoulders, a careful restraint in the tilt of his head, and I knew instinctively that he carried burdens he had never voiced, memories that shaped his every choice, every glance, every command, and I realized that our bond, growing deeper with every day, was entwined with histories we had yet to fully understand, echoes of losses, regrets, and courage that had formed him into the leader he was, yet also left gaps in his trust and vulnerability that only I, as Luna, might ever glimpse. The pack moved around us with their usual rhythm, but even the most ordinary gestures carried weight now. Subtle glances, pauses, the half-smiles of wolves who had endured struggles unseen, layers of experience that revealed themselves in the softest of cues, and I found myself listening not just to words but to the silences between them where truth often hid. Then, as if conjured from the shadows themselves, Kael appeared on the ridge above the clearing, his black form blending with the trees, the red of his left eye catching a glint of sunlight like a spark in the gloom, and though he made no sound, his presence spoke volumes, a reminder that every revelation, every memory we uncovered was observed, measured, and perhaps nudged along a path only he understood, a cryptic guide to the truths lying beneath the surface of the pack, the forest, and even our own hearts. The Alpha finally spoke, voice low, carrying both authority and quiet confession, recounting a story of a betrayal long ago, a choice he had made to protect the pack but which had left him with guilt and questions about loyalty, sacrifice, and the nature of leadership, and as I listened, I felt the depth of his burden and the courage it took to carry it, the vulnerability he allowed me to witness, and I understood that trust was not only a bond between us but a bridge across history, across pain and silence, fragile, sacred conduit for understanding and growth. My own history, too, pressed forward with urgency, memories of times I had hidden from the pack, moments of doubt and fear, losses that had left scars not visible to the eye. And as I allowed these truths to surface, I felt a strange sense of release, a recognition that vulnerability and honesty could bind us as tightly as loyalty and strength, that emotional truths carried as much power as physical prowess, and that in the forest, among the pack, and in the shared spaces of our hearts, understanding could illuminate even the darkest corners. Kael's presence remained a steady, silent thread in the unfolding story, glimpsed at the edges of vision, a rustle in the leaves, a faint flash of red, and I felt his cryptic influence shaping perception, reminding me that the past, while revealing itself in pieces, also held clues to the future, that every memory, every confession, every hidden truth had consequences, subtle yet profound, and that the rogue wolf of secrets was watching, ensuring that awareness and discernment guided every step forward. As the morning deepened, small details revealed themselves. The faint scar across the Alpha's forearm, a mark from a long-forgotten skirmish that carried more meaning than I had realized. The way the youngest wolves looked to him with a mixture of awe and questioning, echoes of stories passed down but softened by time, and the memory of a winter when I had nearly faltered. And the pack had held me upright without a word, each revelation layering into a mosaic of experience that left me breathless with both awe and apprehension. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of moss, rain-soaked earth, and something more elusive, hope perhaps or a warning, and I glanced toward the ridge, catching Kael's silhouette one last time before he melted back into the shadows, red eye flashing like a punctuation mark, signaling that all we had uncovered was only part of a larger truth, one that demanded patience, courage, and the willingness to face not just danger, but the complex web of emotion and history binding the pack together. The Alpha reached out, brushing a stray leaf from my hair, and in that simple gesture, a cascade of emotion swept through me, a mingling of gratitude, connection, and the subtle ache of knowing that our bond had grown deeper than either of us fully understood, strengthened not just by shared duty but by the revelation of what lay hidden in hearts and histories alike. Yet just as the moment settled, a faint movement caught my attention in the clearing, a figure stepping from the mist, unrecognized but familiar in presence, eyes holding the weight of knowledge we had not yet earned. And in the pause that followed, I realized with a sudden sharp clarity that the truths we had uncovered, The emotional layers peeled back like petals to reveal vulnerability, courage, and hidden histories were only the beginning, that even in moments of connection, the pack, the alpha, and I were still entwined in secrets yet unrevealed, and that Kael, ever the silent observer, had been guiding us toward understanding while keeping the most dangerous knowledge just beyond our reach. The wind whispered through the trees, the mist curling around our feet, and I felt the pulse of the forest, the rhythm of the pack, and the presence of Kael converge into a singular awareness that even as bonds deepened, emotional truths revealed themselves and histories unfolded. The story of our world was far from complete, and in that suspended, delicate moment, a revelation struck like a heartbeat, sudden and undeniable. An emotional twist that left me trembling and aware that the path ahead was darker, richer, and far more complicated than I had imagined, and that everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and the secrets we carry in our hearts could shift with the turn of a single decision, leaving me both terrified and certain that the journey forward would demand courage, insight, and the courage to embrace truths hidden in shadow. The forest felt heavier that evening, shadows stretching long and sharp beneath the fading sun, and as I moved through the familiar trail toward the clearing, a tension threaded through the air like an invisible current, pressing against my chest and making every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of twig, feel loaded with consequence. The alpha walked beside me, steady in form but not in presence, his eyes betraying a weariness I had not noticed before, a subtle hesitation that hinted at doubts he carried silently, doubts that perhaps I too could sense but could not name, and I felt a flutter of unease ripple through me, a gnawing recognition that the world I had trusted, the rhythm of the pack, the safety of the forest, even the solidity of our bond, was now fragile, unsteady, vulnerable to forces I could not yet perceive. Kael appeared then at the edge of the clearing, crouched low in shadow, red eye flickering like a warning flame, and even without movement I sensed his presence as both caution and guide, a reminder that tension was not coincidental, that choices, gestures, and even silence carried weight, and that he was silently threading subtle nudges through our awareness, shaping perception and readiness, ensuring that nothing would be taken lightly. The pack moved around us with a quiet nervousness, young wolves exchanging hesitant glances, older members more subdued than usual, and the alpha and I found ourselves navigating not only the physical clearing but the invisible undercurrent of mistrust and apprehension, each step measured, each glance weighted with questions we could not speak aloud, while the forest itself seemed to lean closer, listening, reacting, alive with anticipation. Moments that had once felt ordinary now felt charged. A fallen branch that seemed deliberate in its placement, footprints too close to the perimeter to be natural, the distant cry of a wolf carrying tones of alarm rather than play. And with each signal, Kael's presence flared in my awareness, silent yet insistent, the red of his left eye a punctuation mark that urged vigilance, interpretation, and readiness, as if he were highlighting the cracks in our confidence and the threats waiting just beyond perception. The alpha's hand brushed briefly against mine, steadying, grounding, yet the touch carried the tremor of uncertainty, a subtle acknowledgement that the bonds we had nurtured were being tested, that trust could not be assumed, and that hope, delicate and tenuous, might falter under the weight of what was coming. And as I sensed the forest tightening around us, I realized that our connection, our understanding, and our instincts would be the only anchors against rising tension and unseen pressures. An unexpected movement across the clearing drew my attention, a shadow flickering in the periphery, unrecognizable yet deliberate, and Kael appeared, crouched atop a ridge, red eye fixed sharply on the disturbance, and in that instant, I felt the pull of his silent communication, a warning, a question, a reminder that the world was shifting in ways neither Alpha nor Luna could fully control, that vigilance was not optional, and that every moment of hesitation carried risk. The sun dipped lower, casting long fingers of light that seemed to slice through the forest with urgency, and a small misstep by a young wolf, a tumble that should have been minor, escalated into a subtle cascade of tension as eyes darted and whispers rippled across the clearing, an event amplified not by consequence but by perception, and I understood that even minor disruptions now carried emotional weight, fracturing hope and casting doubt, magnified by the sense that unseen forces, perhaps supernatural, were weaving the threads of uncertainty tighter around us. The Alpha's voice broke the silence, calm but firm, calling for attention, yet even in its steadiness, I sensed restraint, an unspoken acknowledgement that confidence alone would not suffice, and as I met his gaze, I realized that untested trust, though cultivated over days, could falter under pressure, and that the subtle signs Kael left, the angled glance, the rustle in the trees, the faint gleam of his red eye, were guides to navigate the cracks forming in our perception and resolve. A breeze carried a scent unfamiliar, stirring instinct deep within me, and Kael emerged briefly from shadow to circle the clearing, movements deliberate, eyes sweeping. His presence a reminder that vigilance must be active, not passive, that intuition must be trusted, and that the quiet unease threading through the pack was not merely coincidence but an indication that tension was rising toward a precipice. As twilight settled, the forest deepened into indigo and silver, shadows merging with shadow, and the Alpha and I paused near the edge of the clearing, silent acknowledgement passing between us that challenges were imminent, that decisions made in the coming hours would shape not only our bond but the fragile equilibrium of the pack and the world around us, and that we could not rely solely on courage or strength, but needed clarity, awareness, and a readiness to respond to subtle yet significant signals. A sudden shift of movement in the distant underbrush caught my eye, and Kael's red eye flared one last time before vanishing into darkness, leaving a tension that coiled through the clearing like smoke, a silent herald that forces were converging, and that hope, though present, was now tempered by uncertainty. As the first stars pierced the canopy, I realized the Alpha and I were no longer facing ordinary circumstances, that even our growing bond, our trust, and our shared understanding could not shield us from the instability swelling around us, and that the next moments might demand decisions that would separate us from familiar ground, test our instincts, and challenge everything we believed safe and certain, leaving the forest, the pack, and even our hearts suspended in a tense, fragile balance, with Kael watching from the shadows, guiding without interference, and the unspoken message clear. The rising tension was only the beginning, and the next step would determine whether we endured together or were drawn apart. The forest seemed to hold its breath as twilight bled into night, the shadows stretching long and dark beneath towering trees, and as I stepped into the clearing where tension had been simmering for days, I felt a surge of awareness, a heartbeat echoing in my chest, that this moment demanded clarity, courage, and unflinching choice for everything. The pack, the Alpha, even the fragile thread of hope we had nurtured, was now poised on the edge of irrevocable consequence. The Alpha stood before me, posture firm yet eyes clouded with emotion, and I could sense the storm within him, the collision of duty and feeling, the struggle to navigate loyalty to the pack while honoring the bond that had grown between us, and I felt my own emotions mirror the turbulence, a blend of fear, determination, and a strange exhilaration, as though the forest itself had become a crucible for testing hearts, minds, and instincts alike. Around us, the pack gathered uneasily, whispers of tension rippling through the ranks, young wolves shifting nervously while elders exchanged glances loaded with unspoken questions, and I realized that trust, once steady and assured, now felt fragile, delicate as the first frost on leaves, vulnerable to the slightest misstep or misunderstanding. And then from the edge of the shadows, Kael emerged, silent and deliberate, muscles taut beneath his black fur, red eye glinting like a warning ember, and I felt immediately that his presence was not merely observational tonight but strategic, a subtle influence guiding perception, timing, and instinct, signaling that every decision, every glance, every gesture carried weight far beyond what we could fully comprehend, that he was threading awareness into the unfolding storm without ever taking the lead, shaping the confrontation in ways unseen, yet undeniably powerful. The tension escalated as a disturbance arose, a challenge subtle yet potent, manifesting in the form of a rival faction of wolves approaching the clearing with calculated caution, their intentions unclear but undeniably deliberate, and the forest seemed to tighten around us, every rustle of leaves and whisper of wind carrying the weight of potential conflict, the unknown amplifying the stakes, demanding rapid assessment and action. I glanced at the Alpha, whose jaw was set, eyes sharp despite the emotional tempest roiling within, and I understood that we were both balancing the demands of duty, the safety of the pack, and the preservation of trust, and that in this delicate calculus, hesitation could invite consequences far beyond immediate danger. Kael moved silently along the periphery, a shadow among shadows, his red eye briefly catching mine, a wordless message threading through the chaos. Awareness, caution, timing, and trust in instincts, and as I absorbed the subtle guidance, I felt a renewed focus, a sharpening of perception, each detail magnified, each movement interpreted with care, the forest itself seeming to bend toward the climax, the air charged with suspense and the weight of choices yet to be made. The rival wolves drew closer, and tension surged through the pack like an electric current, while the alpha and I exchanged a glance that conveyed strategy, understanding, and unspoken solidarity, a synchrony born of shared trials and deepening connection, yet layered with uncertainty. For we knew that even the smallest miscalculation could ripple through the pack and alter the course of destiny in ways we could not yet measure. Then came the first challenge, a test of patience and resolve rather than brute strength, a verbal clash that carried the weight of history and expectation, the rival faction pressing boundaries with subtle threats, questions of loyalty, and insinuations meant to destabilize confidence, and in each verbal exchange, I felt the tension coil tighter, the stakes of trust, courage, and clarity magnified while Kael watched silently, appearing briefly to mark critical moments, leaving subtle cues in the positioning of shadows, the rustle of leaves, the angle of the clearing itself, a reminder that observation alone was as powerful as intervention when guided with precision. As the confrontation reached its peak, the alpha stepped forward with measured authority, balancing firmness and empathy, while I mirrored his movements, our connection a silent testament to unity and shared purpose. Yet beneath the surface of strategy and measured words, an emotional storm raged, a collision of past fears, present uncertainty, and the weight of what could be lost, and I felt my heart pound with the intensity of the moment, every instinct sharpened, every sense alive to subtle cues, while Kael's presence hovered like a dark beacon, a reminder that the unseen could shape outcomes as decisively as the seen, and just when resolution seemed possible, when words and gestures might stabilize the situation, an unexpected shift occurred. A subtle yet undeniable betrayal, a movement, a whisper, an alignment of forces that threatened to fracture trust, leaving the clearing suspended in a fragile equilibrium, the outcome hanging by the thinnest of threads, and in that heartbeat, I understood that the climax was not defined by strength or strategy alone, but by awareness, courage, and the capacity to act decisively amidst uncertainty. Kael's red eye flashed one final time. From the treeline, a punctuation mark in the tension, and as darkness deepened, the forest closing in around us like a shroud, the confrontation reached a cinematic cliffhanger, a moment of suspended decision, where every heartbeat, glance, and movement promised to alter the course of destiny, leaving the pack, the alpha, and myself poised on the precipice of revelation, action, and change. And the last thing I saw before the shadows swallowed the clearing was Kael's silhouette, unmoving yet unmistakable, a cryptic herald of the next act, ensuring that whatever came next would test courage, trust, and the bonds forged in the crucible of shared trials, setting the stage for the final reckoning that could not be predicted. Only faced with eyes wide open and hearts resolute, the forest was hushed as dawn began to break, soft light spilling through the canopy like a promise, and as I stepped into the clearing once more, every nerve alert, every breath measured, I felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing into my chest, a convergence of destiny, trust, and the fragile threads of love that had grown between the alpha and me, a bond tested by uncertainty, confrontation, and the shadows of secrets that had lingered too long, and in that stillness, the forest itself seemed to lean in, waiting, aware, as though even the trees held their breath in anticipation of what would be revealed. The alpha stood at the center of the clearing, posture unwavering yet softened by emotion, and when our eyes met, I saw the depth of his courage, the vulnerability he had carried silently. For the sake of the pack, the weight of every choice and sacrifice he had made, and in that glance, I felt the echo of my own journey, the doubts faced, the fears overcome, the moments of hesitation now transformed into clarity, purpose, and unwavering resolve. The pack gathered cautiously around us, the air thick with expectation, and every movement, every subtle gesture carried meaning. The tilt of a head, the shift of weight, the silent acknowledgement that we were bound together not only by duty but by shared history, trust, and the unspoken understanding that the world we inhabited demanded courage and awareness beyond ordinary comprehension. Then from the edge of the clearing, Kael emerged silently, shadow folding around him, red eye glowing faintly as if holding the forest in its gaze, and I felt the weight of his presence more acutely than ever before, the awareness that his cryptic guidance, subtle warnings, and careful observation had been shaping this moment, preparing us, threading unseen hands through the currents of destiny, and in a voice that was barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, he said, "The balance is never what it seems, Luna. Only those who see the unseen can endure." And I understood immediately that his role was far deeper than I had ever imagined, that the truths he guarded, the timing of his interventions, and the patience of his observation were all part of a larger design, one that had brought us to this precipice of revelation and choice. The Alpha stepped closer, the tension of the preceding trials giving way to a clarity born of shared purpose, and as we spoke, the words flowing between us felt charged with meaning beyond conversation, a merging of thought, intuition, and emotion that bridged fear, hope, and the quiet ache of understanding. And in that moment, every challenge we had faced, the fractures in trust, the rising tension, the cryptic warnings of Kael, the confrontations that had tested courage, crystallized into the realization that destiny, love, and loyalty were intertwined in ways both fragile and enduring, and that to honor them required not only action but transformation. The forest seemed to pulse in response, leaves rustling like whispered approval, the sunlight striking the canopy in shifting patterns that danced across the clearing, illuminating the faces of the pack, each member bearing silent witness to the unspoken bonds, the hidden truths, and the courage that had been summoned from within us all. And I felt the current of emotion swell, a tide of connection, recognition, and acceptance that encompassed not only the Alpha and myself but the entire rhythm of our lives, the unseen threads of history, and the silent, guiding presence of Kael. And then came the moment that shifted everything, subtle yet seismic, an opportunity to protect, to surrender, to act selflessly, a choice that demanded the release of pride, the embrace of vulnerability, and the courage to trust that the unseen currents, the guidance of Kael, and the bonds we had forged would sustain us. And in that instant I felt the transformation within me, a clarity of purpose and a merging of heart and instinct, the quiet sacrifice of certainty giving way to understanding, the awareness that enduring love and destiny required willingness to act not only for oneself but for the harmony of the pack, the forest, and the path that stretched forward beyond perception. Kael watched from the shadows, silent but present, red eye lingering on us, and I understood that his cryptic words were not merely observation but instruction, a guiding principle etched into the very fabric of the moment, ensuring that what we chose would resonate beyond immediate consequence, shaping the next chapter of our lives in subtle, powerful ways. The Alpha took my hand, the simple gesture carrying a weight of reassurance, commitment, and shared resolve, and as our eyes met, I saw the reflection of the forest, the pack, and the trials we had endured, and it was as if the clearing itself held its breath in recognition of the emotional climax, a suspended moment where past, present, and destiny coalesced, where the threads of love, trust, and courage converged into a singular understanding that every choice mattered, every bond was sacred, and every silent observer, even one as enigmatic as Kael, had played a role in shaping the path we now embraced. And as the first golden rays of morning spilled across the clearing, illuminating the Alpha, the pack, and the shadows from which Kael had watched, a subtle sense of sacrifice settled over me. Not of loss but of the shedding of doubt, hesitation, and fear, a relinquishing of what had bound me to ordinary perception in order to step fully into the extraordinary responsibilities, truths, and love that destiny had woven into my life. And I felt a transformation not only in myself but in the world around me, a harmony of heart, mind, and instinct that rippled through the forest like a silent acknowledgement that the journey had reached its emotional peak. Kael gave one last glance, red eye flickering with inscrutable meaning, then melted into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of his cryptic guidance. And in that quiet aftermath, as the Alpha and I stood together, bound by trust, love, and the understanding of the unseen forces that shaped our lives, I knew that we were ready to face whatever the final act would bring, that our hearts were aligned with the destiny unfolding, and that the forest, the pack, and even the silent rogue of secrets had conspired to prepare us for this ultimate moment of courage, revelation, and enduring connection. The forest was drenched in the golden light of dawn, each leaf, branch, and blade of grass shimmering with the quiet certainty of a new beginning, and as I stepped into the clearing where the pack had gathered, I felt a sense of completion, a harmony between past trials, present courage, and the unfolding destiny that had guided every heartbeat, every choice, and every whispered secret across the days and nights we had endured together. The Alpha stood at the center, strength and calm radiating from him, yet softened by the weight of emotion and the bond we shared. And as our eyes met, I saw the reflection of everything we had weathered, the uncertainty, the confrontations, the revelations of hidden truths, and the subtle, guiding influence of Kael, whose presence had threaded through our journey like a quiet, watchful force shaping perception, timing, and readiness. The pack circled around us with a renewed sense of ease, their movements flowing in harmony, gestures of acknowledgement and respect weaving a tapestry of trust and unity that filled the clearing with warmth and quiet celebration. And in each glance I shared with the members, I recognized the endurance of bonds tested, the loyalty affirmed, and the understanding that destiny, though mysterious, had a rhythm that revealed itself when courage, awareness, and love aligned. And then from the shadows of the forest's edge, Kael emerged one final time, crouched like a dark sentinel, the red of his left eye faint in the morning light, a presence both distant and intimate, and as he observed silently, I felt the weight of his role crystallize. A guardian, a witness, a cryptic guide whose subtle interventions had shaped choices, tested readiness, and ensured the path forward was both challenging and illuminating. And with a soft rustle of leaves, he lifted his head, letting out a low haunting howl that carried across the clearing, resonating with the forest and the pack, a sound that spoke of endings and beginnings, of mysteries kept and revelations shared, and it lingered in the air like a promise that stories yet untold would unfold, that the forest, the pack, and even the rogue wolf of secrets had a rhythm beyond our immediate perception. The alpha reached for my hand, and in that simple touch, warmth, commitment, and understanding flowed between us, a silent acknowledgement that love had endured, strengthened by trials and clarity, and that destiny, though unpredictable, had brought us together in a bond that was as natural as the trees rooted around us, as steadfast as the earth beneath our feet, and as enduring as the forest itself. I looked out across the clearing at the pack, seeing familiar faces softened by relief and quiet joy, young wolves learning the meaning of trust and courage, elders reflecting on guidance and resilience, and the threads of our shared journey woven into every glance, gesture, and subtle interaction, a tapestry of loyalty, growth, and the quiet power of unity. And I understood that our collective story had reached a resolution not of finality but of harmony, where past uncertainties, emotional peaks, and tests of character had been reconciled with understanding, trust, and the acceptance of destiny's flow. Kael lingered at the tree-lean, a shadow among shadows, and as I met his glowing red eye for the last time, he inclined his head once, a cryptic nod that spoke of journeys yet to come, challenges unseen and truth still hidden, a reminder that even in resolution, the world held depth, mystery, and stories waiting in the folds of shadow. And as he melted into the trees, leaving only the echo of presence and the faint scent of the forest stirred by his passing, I felt the final thread of suspense settle into the quiet strength of completion. The alpha and I turned toward the east, where the rising sun painted the sky in streaks of amber, gold, and soft violet, its light spilling over the clearing, illuminating the pack, the forest, and the path we had walked together. And in that moment, every tension, fear, and uncertainty dissolved into clarity, every bond, every secret, every trial transformed into understanding, and the forest itself seemed to exhale, carrying the story into a gentle, enduring rhythm. I reached for the alpha's hand again, feeling the steady beat of courage, loyalty, and love beneath my palm, and in a final glance toward the horizon, the sun's rays caught the dew on the leaves, sparkling affirmation that endings and beginnings are intertwined, that destiny moves in currents both seen and unseen, and that the silent, watchful presence of Kael, though gone from sight, would forever linger in the spaces between shadow and light, a reminder that even as one chapter closes, the forest, the pack, and the bonds of heart and destiny continue, eternal and ever-renewing, leaving behind a memory of resilience, love, and the quiet, enduring mystery of the unseen.